There are three macros remaining to add. The first one is going to be easy, which is when the user says I want to quit. So when they select close macro, and I want to start out by adding that. So we have something easy to begin with, which is that case is equal to close macro. Then I simply want to unload me, which will then close this user form, and then the macro that runs it will then end. I want to then say if the case is that I want to add the macro, which is then the text add and unlock Collab, I want to do something more complicated than simply calling the macro. I want to then check whether the amount of rows in this table is equal to the amount of rows in this table, because if so, you've added all the collabs. As I want to say if the range TBL unlocked, specifically the unlock collabs column, dot count, so the count of rows, that's equal to the range TBL all collabs, and also the collab column specifically, that's count, then I want to say, well, you've already added all the unlocks. And if this is then false, then I want to do something. I then want to check if the first row of the TBL unlock collabs is blank, because if so, then you haven't added any. And that will make it easy to create this drop down list, because then that will simply be all of the collabs. So if this is empty, you haven't added any collabs, which means you need to select from all the collabs, which I can do by saying then range. I've actually already done it down here for testing. Right now, the first row isn't going to be empty, but I can delete these. And this is what the table would look like when you run this macro for the first time. This will now be empty, which means I can ask if this is empty. So this is equal to blank. Then you haven't added any collabs. This means I actually need to add a variable, which I haven't done yet. I want that in here. And I want this to be an array because I want to get a drop down both for adding and removing a collab. So I'm going to reuse it. I want to call this array for add and remove collabs. And I want to say that this array should then be equal to the entire collab column from all collabs, which means I can copy this part. And if this isn't the case, meaning I do have some collabs, then I want to say that the array for add remove should be equal to a function that I haven't created yet, which I then want to go and do. But before I do that, I want to also create this user form. I'm going to be making one extra user form that I can use for both adding and removing collabs. I go in and add a new user form, which I'll then call add remove. And I teased this in the first episode where I said that you can reuse user forms, and now I'm actually going to do it. As always, I want to add a command button, which will be the OK or confirm, which I'll call CB OK. And then the accelerator is going to be O. Actually, it's going to be a big O. And the caption should then also be OK. And likewise, I'll add a cancel button. And I'm not going to make things gritty. Then I need a text. And lastly, I then want my combo box, which will then house my array, which is then going to be called the add remove box, which is what I'll be calling when I want to fill this up, just as I filled up the first drop down. And then I need to remember to say that when you click cancel, it should use the unload me, which simply closes it. And then I don't want to continue with the OK button, except I do want to add it. So I now have that. I then want to go back and create my function, this AddCollab-function, which I want to store in my module. So I want to store this way down at the bottom. And in order to help myself, I want to create this add remove tag variable, which will be a global variable, which means I want to dim it up here before my first sub. And this is going to make it easier to reuse this user form. And this is going to be a function called AddCollab, and it doesn't take any arguments. And I do need a lot of variables, which I'm just going to copy paste in to cheat. I want the all unlocks column, I want the all collabs column, and then I want to create the remaining collabs, which is going to be the anti-join, meaning when I want to add collabs, I want to take this column and remove the ones from this column, so I can re-add these. And when I want to remove them, I then only want the ones in here, which is a lot easier. And that's why I'll show that last. I need to do an outer and inner looper, and I want to do a row count and count the number of unlocks. And then I need this helper already in array. To begin with, I'll say number of unlocks should be equal then to this column, which in this case is going to be 2. And I need to check if I only have 1, and this is going to be relevant when I then add my collab. I want that to be beneath the current unlock collabs. But I found an error, which is where if I only have 1, then the method I'm going to be using, if I just delete that row, the method I'll be using effectively goes into the column and then presses Control arrow down, but it actually doesn't go down to the first row, it goes down all the way to the bottom. So that won't work. which is why I want to start out with checking that if number of unlocks is equal to 1, then I want to redim my all unlocks to then be 1 to 1 and 1 to 1. And this is another issue that I ran into, which is where, because variance can actually be any data type, it can also be a single range or a single value. And when I only have one unlock, I'm going to run into the issue that it doesn't want to be an array, which means if I do only have one unlock, then I need to define this to be an array. Actually, it's not a string, it becomes a range in this case, I believe at least. And then I can say that my all unlocks 1, 1 should then be equal to this range tbill unlock collabs. And this then only has a single value. If I do have more than one unlock, then I can say the normal method, which is saying that all unlocks should then be equal to my range. Then I can say that all collabs should be equal to my entire column. And you've seen that a lot of times, which is why I'm copy pasting. And then I want to redim my remaining collabs to then be 1 to the upper bound of all collabs minus the number of unlocks, which is again saying in this case I have 23 rows minus 2, which is then 21. That's how many rows I want. I then want to loop through the lower bound of all collabs to the upper bound, because I now need to fill in my remaining collabs array. I then use my helper variable to say that this should be false, meaning I haven't already added the collab. And then I'll do my inner loop, which is then going through my unlocks. In this case, that would be 2 rows. Here I want to check if the collab in my inner loop, that is in all unlocks, is equal to the collab in all unlocks, which means I then have already added it, and then I don't want to add it again. All collabs looper outer, 1 is equal to all unlocks looper inner, 1. Then I want to set my flag already in array to be equal to true, and then I want to exit prematurely because there's no reason to continue looping through my unlock collabs if I've already set this flag. Now I've looped through all of my unlocks, and I can say if already in array is false, then I want to add it. Then I want my row count to be equal to itself plus 1, and then I want to add. And I actually don't know if this is going to be okay because I haven't set row count to be anything yet, but I think this should be fine because it's then saying row count is currently nothing and nothing plus 1 is equal to 1. But this should then be equal to all collabs looper outer, 1, which means I've now filled up this array. Because this is a function, I need to remember to say that the name of the function should then be equal to whatever I want the function to output, which is then the array remaining collabs. So that wasn't so bad. Then I can go back to my user form and say that I've now called my function AddCollab, which means that all the way at the end here, still within the else block, which means I do have at least one collab. I now have my array for add remove collabs to either be one value. If I have no unlocks, then my array for add remove collabs is all collabs, and otherwise it's only the ones I haven't added. And then while inside of this else block, I then want to fill up this drop down for my add remove user form, which is then the add remove box, and its list should then equal my array for add remove. And then I set my add remove tag to be equal to add, and then I want to show add remove, which will then boot up this user form where I still need to add the code if I say okay. And it quickly gets complicated when you have multiple user forms. In this case, I have one module and 2 user forms, and as I did with my original user form, I want to have, instead of doing this select case, I'm choosing to make it a variable instead, which doesn't really matter which method you choose. I'm just showing that there are multiple methods. I want to say chosen collab should be a string, and chosen collab should then be equal to my add remove box, which is value. And then I can say if my add remove tag is equal to add, and then I can say else if add remove tag. And here I could also use select case, but again, I'm choosing not to because there are many methods. So this is preparation for later. I'll only add that after I'm done with the adding macro. You now have this user form where you select the collab to add, and I want to add that to the bottom. And I mentioned that before, that there's an issue here if you only have one unlock, which is where it's going to try to go down all the way to the bottom in row 1 million and then add it there, and that's going to give an error because when you're in the last row you can't go down to the next row, which is why I first want to check, as I did before. Actually, first I want to check if the first value is blank, which means this is my first collab. Then I simply want to set this cell to be equal to my chosen collab, and I don't have to do any sorting. Otherwise, I want to check if I only have one row, because as I just mentioned, that's going to give an issue. So if the count of rows in this column is equal to 1, and I should remember to add my endif, If this is the case, then I want to go into this selection, and I can show that actually. If I delete that row, I can then go inside, grabbing the address for this portion. Then this is J6, and that's not actually what I expect, because I do have both a column header and a row. And in this case, I guess because there's only one value or one row, it's going to give me this value, and it's not going to give me a selection. If I do only have one collab, I want to go into this cell, which I already know how to get the address because that's this portion. And then I want to offset that cell by one row, and then I want to add my value. So go into this, which in my case right now gives J6. Then I want to offset my selection by one row, and this should then be equal to chosen collab. And Excel is smart enough that if you add a value underneath a table, then it will expand the table, meaning I don't have to worry about this. And I want to do my sorting afterwards because I have to sort in any case, and then I don't want to do it here. And lastly, if I do have more than one unlock, then I don't just want to go into the first cell, I want to go down to the bottom. And if I then try to do this, where I now have two collabs, it will give me a range of two cells, and I don't want to do that exactly. I want to go down to the bottom using end Excel down. Then if I call address again, it will give me only one cell, and then I want to do my offset. So I want to select my entire column, go down to the bottom cell, and go one row down, which I can do in a single line by doing exactly this, end Excel down, and then offset by one row, and this should then be equal to chosen collab. After adding my collab, I can then do my sorting, which is saying that I want to go into the range TBL unlocks, actually unlocked, which is now the entire table, and I want to sort this where my key is going to be the entire column, which was called unlock collabs. So I want to do my sorting of the entire table based on this one column. And of course, I do only have one column, but this is how the syntax is. And then my order should then be Excel ascending, which means it's going to be from A to Z. And I also want headers to be Excel yes, because this does select my entire header. And then lastly, I want to use unload me to close this user form. And after closing it, I then add a message box telling you, well, you added the chosen collab to the list of unlocked collabs. I then have my last macro to add, where I go back to the user form, the original one, and say that if my case is to remove an unlocked collab, and now I do have a lot of clutter here, which is generally not good. So I could make this a macro itself if I wanted to, and I probably should. In any case, here I want to say, well, if you want to remove an unlocked collab, then I first want to check, is there actually at least one collab that you've unlocked? Otherwise, you couldn't remove them. And I've already done that here, right here. If this is equal to blank, then you haven't actually added an unlock, which I then want to inform the user of. And if this isn't the case, which means you do have at least one unlock, then I want to use my array for add remove collabs, which would then simply be equal to this entire column, because this is my selection of collabs to remove, which I can grab from up here. And likewise, I need this add remove list to be equal to my array. And then I want to set my tag to not be add, but to be remove. And then I want to show it. And before I go in and add that function, inside of my second user form, I want to do one check to say, if you end up in the position where you remove your last collab, I want the user to be informed of this. And I can say, if this is then equal to blank, then the user removed their last collab, and you should be informed. Now I can go into my add remove collabs, where I then need to add my very last piece of code, which is to say that now my tag is to remove. And then I have already selected the collab from chosen collab. So I want to go into this table and look for the chosen collab and then delete it. I don't want to clear the cell because that would simply remove the cell's value, but not the cell itself, which means I end up with this empty row. If I instead say delete, I delete the cell, then the rows below will be shifted up. The dimensions of the table change, which is what I want. Meaning I want to use the find method to find my chosen collab and then delete that, which is to say, I want to go into range, TBL unlocked, specifically the unlock collabs column, and I want to find, what do I want to find? I want to find chosen collab, and then when I do find that, and the output of find is then the cell that is a range object, I then want to delete it. And again, I want to use unload me to get rid of the user form, and then I can say I didn't add, but I did remove my chosen collab from the list, so that should be from. And I can then save this, and if I've done everything correct, then I can go ahead and delete this, and then I want to run my macro. This was my run user form, and I want to do a remove an unlock collabs, which shouldn't be possible. I can add an unlock collab, and here I have all of my options. Now I've added wrapdog, which we can see, and if I add another one, I now don't have wrapdog anymore, and I can press cancel, and it doesn't break. I can then say I want to remove an unlock collab, and I only have 2 options. When I then, okay, so it did actually get mad, and that's why it's good to check. And this was the problem I ran into before also, where I now only have one value and it doesn't understand that this should be an array. It's trying to make it a string. It was fortunate that you got to see this error. And I think if I simply wrap this in array, which will then turn this value into an array, if I try to do that, then it is still a string. It's still saying it's a string, but it definitely works. So it's not exactly the best solution, but it does work. And that was another method I found. And it seems to work, I guess, sometimes. My option is either to wrap this array for add remove collabs within the array function, which can then turn this one cell into an array instead of being a string, which is then what I want. And the other option was, if I can find that, which was to say that if I only have the one unlock, then it's going to give me a range, and that's actually not a range, it was a string. So I was correct the first time. I can then do this redimming 1-to-1 and say that my array 1-to-1 should be equal to it. That's one option. And the other option was to then wrap it in array, which I did here, and then that also worked. And I would prefer this method because it's less code. In any case, that was everything I had to show. So, yep,